people. Hello, my name is Ramsey, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, where we host a range of events and classes. I'd like to ask you to please take your time to silence your phones, and during the Q&A portion, please ask your questions into the microphone. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome Karen Hao to talk about her new book, Empire of AI. By drawing on viewpoints of Silicon Valley engineers, Kenyan data laborers, and Chilean water activists, Hao presents the fullest picture of AI and its impacts we've seen to date, alongside a trenchant analysis of where things are headed. An astonishing eyewitness view from both up in the command capsule of the new economy and down where the real suffering happens, Empire of AI pierces the veil of the industry defining our era. Karen Hao is an award-winning journalist covering the impacts of artificial intelligence on society and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. She leads the Pulitzer Center AI Spotlight series, a program training journalists around the world on how to cover AI. She sits on the AI advisory board of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. How will be in conversation with Bina Venkataraman. Venkataraman is an American journalist, science policy expert, and author. She is currently editor-at-large of Strategy and Innovation and an inaugural columnist of The Future at the Washington Post. We are so lucky and fortunate to have an incredible journalist with us tonight. So please help me in welcoming Karen Hao and Bina Venkataraman.
Hello, everyone.
Can you hear us okay? Okay.
Good. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Bina.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
This is an extraordinary book and
Thank you.
an extraordinary and important book. And it's also gripping to read. It's like you don't want to put it down. And it's a play-by-play of what's happening in a very important American company, but a company that is transforming technology, transforming the world, and you make some really important arguments. But I want to start by saying something about you and asking you kind of how you got here, because recently I was in Berlin and I went to see this retrospective of Yoko Ono's work, and it's her work, her trajectory from her life well before she was famous for marrying John Lennon and well after. And I was struck when I was looking at her work, like so many things I saw in her conceptual art were really foundational, and they were like the progenitors of later conceptual art. And I was blown away. I kept thinking, Yoko Ono did it first. And I was thinking of you when I was there. And the reason is, that's what I feel when I read a lot of AI journalism today. I'll think, Karen wrote that piece first. Karen wrote that piece 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So I've been following you in your career. I've had the privilege of reading you for a really long time. And when you were at MIT Tech Review, you were writing some of the early pieces on algorithms and their discriminatory effects on facial recognition software and the bias it would reinforce on the way AI was being used by indigenous communities to save their languages. So you've been following these stories for so long, and obviously then you went to the Wall Street Journal, and now more recently to the Atlantic, to cover AI as an industry, to cover AI as a technology, to cover the communities affected by AI. But what I want to know is how and why you came to write this book. Like, why did you want to write this book? Why did you choose to write this book?
This is why I chose Bina to be my moderator. Thank you so much. And Bina is also, she's one of my greatest mentors, and I respect her so much as a journalist as well. So I wanted to write this book because I have been covering AI since 2018, which feels like a long time ago. And I was saying this to someone the other day, and they were like, so you covered it before it existed? And you know, AI has actually been around since the 1950s, so I was a little bit late to the game from that perspective, but it does feel like I got really lucky in that I started covering it before ChatGPT suddenly made the conversation really, really noisy. And so I had an opportunity to truly learn about the technology, how it works, what its limitations are, and start observing those early days in which it became a commercial endeavor and started interfacing with society and the ways that it started falling apart as it was interfacing with society. And part of that journey was that I was also the first journalist to ever profile OpenAI back in the day. I embedded within the company in 2019 for 3 days when it was still conceived of as a nonprofit and a fundamental research lab that had no commercial intent. And my history with the company is I then profiled the company and said, it doesn't really seem like this is a nonprofit anymore and we should really be skeptical of this company. And then they really didn't like me and we've had a contentious relationship ever since. But I wanted to take the opportunity to write an artifact that people could pick up to understand this full history and full progression of AI as a technology, of OpenAI as a company, and ultimately where the ideology that OpenAI has and their particular conception of AI could lead us if we don't actually resist it. Because ultimately, I'm very, very critical of the impact that they've had on AI development. And the main lesson that I really wanted to give people is technology is not inevitable. It's very much a product of human choices. But if ChatGPT were the first version of AI that you ever came across, it would really feel like, oh, this is just what it is. This is what AI. This is the only manifestation, the only pathway of AI. That's how it naturally would evolve, and that's not true at all. It very much is a product of a specific and I would argue extremely narrow worldview about how the world works and how it should continue to work. And ultimately, if people understand that and understand that they have choice and agency in continuing to shape the trajectory of AI moving forward, we will get to a much better place where we do, in fact, have a much broader range of AI technologies that deliver benefit to society.
So I want to talk about this idea of inevitability, which is what you're bringing up right now. This idea that technology, that as it gets unleashed and as we start using it, is inevitable and it sort of dictates the future. One of the things, really interesting things you document is the earlier entrepreneurial life of Sam Altman. So you're really following him, you're following the characters behind OpenAI, as well as people affected by AI throughout this book. But what was so fascinating was reading about how Sam Altman used to talk about one of his former startups, which was kind of a failed enterprise. He exited with a few $1 million, as he tends to be successful in doing. But this startup called Looped. And when Sam was the CEO of Looped and founder of Looped, which was about location tracking, he would talk about how location tracking was the inevitable future, that everyone would be sharing their locations at all times. And obviously, not all of us are doing that. Some people do that on social media, but it's actually not become, right, the dominant trend that people want to share where they are with everyone all the time.
Yeah.
So when you think about that and look at where we are now with AI and ChatGPT, this idea of inevitability, I confess that there are times when I think, okay, it's just inevitable that we're all going to be using these chatbots and large language models. And when I write about it and think about it, I think if we accept that that's true, how do we go about adapting to that world and creating checks and balances?
Exactly.
But what is the argument? I guess, what's your argument for not accepting that as inevitable right now? Is that what you're saying, that we shouldn't accept it as inevitable, that that's been programmed? And if so, what's the consequence of that for how we think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the title of my book, Empire of AI, is a nod to this argument that I make, that these companies like OpenAI should be thought of as new forms of empire. They are not just companies anymore. They are not just developing business monopolies. They have significant economic and political influence and developing a controlling influence on all facets of society, all different industries. They're developing a foundational technology that is becoming invisible because it's becoming infrastructure. And you don't know anymore if, when you go to the doctor's office, whether your doctor might actually be using ChatGPT to do certain things with your medical diagnoses. You don't know if your kid is going to a school now where they might be using ChatGPT, or the teacher might be using ChatGPT to evaluate them or shape their education. And ultimately, this empire argument that I base it off of the fact that there are a few shared features between what I call empires of AI and empires of old. The first one is that they lay claim to resources that are not their own, but they interpret the rules to suggest that it was always their own. So all of the data that they scrape from the public internet, they say it's public. Of course we can use it. But of course, the people who put that data on there did not do it with informed consent that it could be scraped and then turned into technologies that might ultimately harm them. Empires also engage in a lot of labor exploitation. So that's not just referring to the fact that these companies actually contract an enormous amount of labor, predominantly in the global south or in other economically vulnerable communities around the world, to perform things like content moderation for their models. It also refers to the technologies that they're building. OpenAI's definition of so-called artificial general intelligence is highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work. So they explicitly state that they are trying to develop labor automating technologies, and that in and of itself is a form of labor exploitation. Empires also monopolize knowledge production. So one of the things that has happened in the last decade is because these companies are so rich and they're able to afford such high compensation packages that can easily cross over $1 million for these AI researchers, most AI researchers in the world today are moving from universities and work at companies. So most of the AI research today is actually filtered through the lens of what is good for these companies. And we do not actually see research anymore that is bad for these companies. And that research is the foundation of public understanding of how this technology works and what its limitations are. And then the final feature is that empires always have this narrative that there are evil empires and good empires. And they, the good empire, need to do all this resource extraction, all this labor exploitation to be an empire, to make themselves strong so they can beat back the evil empire. And I write throughout the book that OpenAI shifts who the evil empire is throughout its history based on what's convenient. Early on, the evil empire was Google. Increasingly, the evil empire is China. But it's always, there's always this fluctuating, we don't want this technology to fall in the hands of bad guys. So that's why you can't put any rules on us. That's why we need to monopolize all of this wealth and all of this power. And a facet of that is, as the good empire, what they are doing is civilizing the world. They are bringing progress and modernity to everyone in the world and giving humanity a gift to bring them to heaven instead of damn them to hell.
Yeah. In your early conversations with Greg Brockman, who is one of the leaders at OpenAI, right hand to Sam Altman, one of the co-founders, he talks to you about AI solving big problems like climate change and healthcare, and that's a very common refrain actually from proponents and leading technology advocates and architects of these large language models. Where are we now in terms of the reality of how AI is being applied to solve some of those big world problems? Like, what's the status check on that?
So one of the most interesting things about the AI debate is that AI as a term is so muddled because it's like the term transportation. There are so many different forms of transportation. You can have a bicycle, you can have a rocket, you can have a self-driving car, you can have a gas-guzzling truck, and all of them are different forms of transportation, but they clearly operate in different ways. There are different costs and benefits associated with each of them, and AI is like that too. But whereas with transportation, we will specify we need more public transit, not just more transportation in general. With AI, it's just AI is good or maybe AI is bad, and no one can really parse apart which kind of AI we're talking about. And so the type of AI that OpenAI champions, which is really large-scale models that are trained on the entirety of the English language internet and trained on massive supercomputers, to go to the what Brockman told me, like AI could solve climate change. This specific conception of AI is actually accelerating climate change right now. There was a projection from McKinsey saying that the amount of energy that is needed to support the rapid acceleration of computational infrastructure all around the world based on the current pace of its growth, we will need to add 2 to 6 times the amount of energy that is consumed by California every year to the global grid in 5 years' time to support that. And Sam Altman recently testified in front of the Senate and admitted that this will most likely come from natural gas. So he picked the nicest fossil fuel. But what he was really saying is it will come from fossil fuels because these data centers have to be powered 24/7. They cannot just run on renewable energy. And there's already plenty of reporting, including in the Washington Post, about how there are actually coal plants that were supposed to be retired whose lives are now being extended to support the development of this infrastructure. On the other hand, there are plenty of phenomenal AI technologies that could help support the advancement of fighting climate change. And there's this amazing organization called Climate Change AI, that's a nonprofit, that catalogs a lot of what they call high leverage problems for tackling this challenge with AI models. But what they're talking about when they say AI is not these colossal models. They're actually talking about very task-specific machine learning systems that are trained on small amounts of data that only need small computers and can do things like weather prediction, can do things like integrating more renewable energy into the grid, can do things like material discovery to find new energy storage solutions. And so the cost-benefit analysis of those models is one that is the opposite direction. There's much more climate benefit than climate cost. But one of the things that this organization has long said, because it's been around for maybe 6 years or 8 years at this point, is these technologies have been around for a very long time. It's actually not a technical problem. It's just a lack of political will that we haven't deployed it at scale.
Yeah, one of the things you document in the book also is how a number of AI companies, let's say companies that are focused on the chatbots, have made decisions like Baidu, including Baidu in China, to move away from AI applications to research like drug discovery and climate and fuels into this area that is very consumer facing, which is about using AI to retrieve information through these predictive models. And how, I guess, why has that happened? Why is it that the focus has shifted so much away from research applications? I think you've mentioned something about the knowledge acquisition from universities, but why is it the case that they chose to focus on these specific applications?
One of the things that happened when companies shifted to developing these models, because initially they thought that they could make a lot of money from them. It's a little bit unclear now whether or not it's a profitable business at all. But initially, when they started investing in it, they were like, "This could have great commercial potential. We can develop a robust business off of these consumer-facing tools." But the issue was it came with a significant trade-off, which is because they're so computationally intensive, they don't have enough computer chips to then allocate to anything else. And so Google and DeepMind, which DeepMind was a separate AI research lab that Google had acquired and was allowed to operate independently and do more fundamental scientific questions at the time. When Google decided to focus on developing what is now BARD, they consolidated Google and DeepMind, and all of the other research that was happening got absorbed. All the computer chips had to be taken and put towards the BARD effort instead of towards
Gemini, right?
Gemini, towards the Gemini effort instead of what they had originally been working on, which was, AlphaFold. That was a breakthrough in chemistry for a task-specific AI model trained to solve the protein folding problem. When you get an amino acid sequence, how is that protein going to look, which is really key to drug discovery, key to understanding diseases, and ended up winning the 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. They shifted their resources from that kind of work to then developing these consumer-facing applications. And it was the same story with Baidu. I was at the Wall Street Journal at the time covering Baidu, and they just ran out of chips, so they pulled all of the computer chips from AI researchers that were developing healthcare applications towards their version of ChatGPT called ErnieBot. And so it was essentially that. There was a resource constraint. They couldn't do everything in their portfolio, so they just shifted to the one that was most obviously commercial.
So Google DeepMind is still doing work on drug discovery powered by AI. They still have this neuroscientist leader there, Demis Hassabis, and so they're doing that work. But what you're saying is that the calculus has been that the chatbots are the way to make big profit. I mean, is this like, because you could imagine if it actually worked for drug discovery, if it actually worked for some of these applications, that could be really profitable. So how much of this is about sort of like generating a hype cycle? Because when people interact with something that can write, their instruction, their recipe as a Shakespeare sonnet or whatever it is, there's a wow factor to that.
I think it's both the need to perpetuate the hype cycle and also the need to not appear like you're falling behind what most people in the public think is a demonstration of innovation. So Google, when ChatGPT came out and a lot of people started using ChatGPT as search, which by the way, it's not a good replacement for search because it hallucinates a lot, which means it generates all kinds of errors when you're trying to get accurate information. Google declared a code red because they saw consumers shifting towards it, believing that it was the new search. And so shareholders then were pressuring Google saying, what are you doing to keep your search lead? So even though the technology is not necessarily panning out to be all that people thought it would be, there's still such a short-term perception gain that they're trying to win in order to continue floating their share price, that there is a self-perpetuating cycle where even if it's not necessarily long-term sustainable business, in the short term, you need to continue to feel like you're on the bleeding edge. And if everyone thinks that ChatGPT is the bleeding edge, then you have to race after that and create your own.
So I hesitate to bring up this person's name since he's finally leaving Washington, but we have to talk about Elon Musk because he's part of this book, and you profile the very sort of seminal moment when Elon Musk and Sam Altman part ways. They were vying for power, vying to be the CEO, and working their two other co-founders to try to see which of them would prevail. And in the process, I mean, this is actually probably the kindest portrait of Elon Musk I've read in recent months, I would say, in that it chronicles and takes in earnest his argument, which is that he fears artificial general intelligence. He fears like the singularity, if you take him, at his word on that. And he conceives of OpenAI in these early days when he's still united with Sam Altman as a kind of more ethical approach to building AI, one in which he has control, of course. But and then they part ways, and obviously they part ways in part because Musk loses out in becoming the CEO. But do you come away from that, watching that trajectory, thinking actually Musk cares about ethical AI? He actually does care about it, and saw that Sam Altman, which you document throughout the rest of the book, was straying from that vision. Like, do you have any sense of that?
I think just in general, from reporting on the tech industry for a while, one of the things that I realized early on is people believe that they believe that they're doing good. So it's like when Musk said early on he was terrified of AI taking over the world, I'm sure he believed that. And when Altman, one of the things that Altman actually talks about in his, he was an avid blogger back when he first started his career, and it's an interesting treasure trove of many of the thoughts that he developed about how he thought about business and strategy and just how to be an effective operator in the space. And one of the things he always said is there are three key ingredients to being a successful founder of a company, and one of them is self-belief, which I uncharitably characterize in the book as self-delusion. Like you really need to have a belief of something, and whether or not that's actually what's then perpetuating your actions is a different story. But a lot of these characters, they don't necessarily have self-awareness of the fact that they're also deeply motivated by a desire for power and a desire for control. So Musk and Altman both, during that early era, when they were talking about conceiving of an OpenAI that would be a counter to Google, it was from they thought from a place of good, but also certainly from a place of power. And that's exactly what's happening now, with Musk repeatedly saying that Altman is not trustworthy, Altman is doing all these things, and then and that are terrible, and then also on the side creating XAI, which is doing exactly the same things that are terrible. I think he does actually genuinely believe that he believes Altman is terrible and he's doing it for the benefit of everyone. Just the same way that he, when he was talking from the White House, he would constantly say, "This is the way to fix democracy." I'm sure he believes that, so it all comes from they themselves. Silicon Valley is really the people who float to the top. They're really good at telling stories to people about what they're doing and why. And they also have to have a really powerful story that they tell themselves.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, because this is a very human story fundamentally. And I actually think that that's such a service to the conversations about technology and the conversations about AI we're having now, to really understand it as a human enterprise. And that's what you do by getting into these personalities, getting into their interpersonal conflicts and alliances in this book. But Sam, so this idea of self-belief, I want to push against that a little bit, because part of what you describe in this book is a person who will tell people exactly what they need to hear to manipulate them at various stages throughout the development of this company. Mm-hmm. And that portrait is more intricate and detailed than I ever appreciated, just being as a consumer of the news about OpenAI. So in what ways do you see Sam Altman as part of that Silicon Valley echelon of delusional self-believers versus a different kind of operator who's a little more Machiavellian? Or is it some mix of those two?
I think he's very much a product and animal of Silicon Valley. He also, I think, takes a lot of the lessons that he learned coming up in Silicon Valley to the extreme. So his skill is, as I mentioned, telling these grandiose stories about the future and really persuading people to cede power to him. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the difference between Musk and Altman. Musk is much more a coercive, he seizes power. Altman he persuades people to cede the power. So he is really good at telling people the thing that motivates them to give him power, to join him on whatever quest he's trying to get them to join him on. And that's also why he's an incredible fundraiser. He really can go into a room and tell exactly the story that that specific investor needs to buy into that vision. But the thing that I think he takes to the extreme is, yesterday I was talking with someone about, what's the difference between Altman and Steve Jobs? Because Steve Jobs was also a brilliant storyteller, and some people also said that he lied all the time. And what I think to me is the difference is that Jobs was very consistent about where he was going, and the story that he was telling was about where he was going. But with Altman, people often could not, no matter how long people worked with him or how closely people worked with him, among all the people that I interviewed, people couldn't actually say where Altman was going. They couldn't actually put a finger on whether the stories he was telling was where he was leading people. There was an inconsistency there. There was a concern that actually he was saying one thing but doing another, and that was the most consistent thing that other people described was the uneasiness about not really fully being able to pin down his belief system. And it's really hard. It was one of the reporting challenges that I had was trying to figure out, because there is a lot of characterizations of Altman that are quite polarizing. Some people say he's the greatest tech leader of our generation, and some people say that he's a liar. And originally, when I started asking people, what do you think of Sam? They would split between these two things, and it really got me nowhere. And so eventually what I started doing was asking people, what did Sam say to you in this specific meeting at this point in time in the company about what he believed and about what he wanted to do and why? And because I interviewed enough people through every era of the company, I was able to ask multiple people at each stage of the company these questions. And that's when I realized, oh, he actually says what he says he believes is what that person that he's talking to believes. And he switches his answer based on the individual.
Fascinating. One of the moments where I laughed out loud in this book was when he has, you describe an incident where Sam Altman, in 2023, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, rents out a movie theater to have a screening of Oppenheimer. I guess that timing aligns with that movie.
Yes.
And afterwards, he's dismayed that he doesn't think that Oppenheimer does a good enough job. It misses the opportunity to recruit people to be physicists. So he has this idea that maybe not knowing that Oppenheimer deeply regretted building the bomb and, thought himself the destroyer of worlds. So that, I guess, feeds into that idea of some delusional thinking, but also some sort of like trying to spin historical technologies in a different way. And he's an apologist for Napoleon, which is fascinating to me. And it's fascinating that people buy into that. And I'm wondering if you can say another word about why people find him so compelling, because he has been able to he brought along Bill Gates. He got that final sign off so that Microsoft would invest. He brought along some of the most talented AI researchers in the field to work with him.
He's really good at understanding what people want, and he's very well resourced to give that to them. So the Bill Gates example is really interesting because Bill Gates had actually quite a lot of influence in the early history of OpenAI because OpenAI was trying to get a major investment from Microsoft. And even though Bill Gates wasn't technically an executive or I believe he wasn't even on the board anymore at the time, he had huge sway. And so Altman not only understands what people want, he also understands power dynamics very well. And so he identified that in order to get the investment from Microsoft, he needed to first convince Gates that this was worth investing in, not just Satya Nadella. And Gates was actually very dismissive of the technology in the early days. He was like, this is an idiot savant. It's just a text generation tool. Like, what are you going to do with that? I really want a research assistant. That's when I'll start paying attention. And if you can show me a tool that can get a 5 on the AP biology exam, that to me will be an indicator that we are on the path towards building a research assistant that has more scientific utility. So Altman basically mobilized resources within the organization to do exactly that. And so there was a cohort of people within OpenAI that spent, I think it was a 1-month sprint to figure out how to turn their technology into something that could solve the AP biology exam. And then they successfully did it. They presented it to Gates. Gates was hugely impressed. And that's what greenlit a huge investment from Microsoft. And so Altman is that it's like he understands the power dynamics. He knows who he needs to sway. He knows what's going to sway them. And then he orchestrates the resources to do that. But the thing about the very interesting thing about that model and its ability to pass the AP biology exam is OpenAI didn't ever tell anyone what they trained this model on. So did they train it on the AP biology exam, and therefore is it only passing the AP biology exam and not actually doing other scientific reasoning very well? I mean, it's possible, you know. So they were able to, and they had this very staged demo where they actually developed a bespoke interface just for what they called the Bill Gates demo. And later on, that interface actually then turned into early inspiration for ChatGPT. But it was down to that level where they were really curating, staging the whole journey of Bill Gates's experience to secure that final investment.
Performance art.
Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. And I want to ask you a little bit more about how you got the story that you told here, because you got, after that tech review story, you got shunned by the company for 3 years. You couldn't talk to them on officially. So how did you get people to talk to you? Who did you talk to reconstruct this history of the company?
Yeah, so OpenAI, as I mentioned, wasn't a fan of my profile, and they actually, when I was at MIT Tech Review, there was another AI reporter on staff, and they would only send him emails and not me. And he at one point said, "Hey, there's 2 of us. You need to send things to Karen." And they were like, "Oh no, we have a history." So they were quite explicit about not wanting to speak with me. But when I started, I actually thought that I wouldn't be able to do this book without their cooperation. So I spent a lot of time trying to thaw that relationship and trying to persuade them to participate in the book. And I was like, you already know my work. You already know that it's critical. I'm not going to try and pretend that it's not going to be critical. But of course, I want to be fair and reflect your perspective. And I want to give you the opportunity to defend the reporting that I find and the conclusions that I draw. And you tell me why you think differently. And initially, they actually thought they actually said that they were going to participate in the book. And then the board crisis happened. The company started being a lot more under fire, both by regulatory scrutiny and by the public. There were accumulating lawsuits from artists, from the New York Times, all these things. And then they pulled out very, very last minute, once I had already bought my flights to go to the company and do interviews with them. And I initially, when they pulled out, was like, this is not going to be possible anymore. I'm just not going to be able to do this book, because they had for so long told me that they hated me effectively. And I thought that this was the opinion of all employees at the company, and that if I reached out to these employees, there was just no way to convince them once the company said from the top, don't speak to this journalist. I was really surprised that it was actually the opposite. There were a lot of people that I reached out to that explicitly wanted to speak to me, because they were like, we loved your profile and we thought it was really, really accurate. And we think that you'll do a really good job with this book by being able to speak to what's actually happening rather than what the executives are saying is happening. So that was one reason why employees spoke to me. And I was speaking to over 90 OpenAI people for the book. But another was, there were a lot of employees who really needed therapy. They just felt uncertain about what they had experienced, and they didn't know how to wrestle with that. And I am effectively a therapist that knows all of the characters. Like, I know all the people that they work with. I know their personalities. I know all of the projects. I know the research. I can speak in depth about what they went through, and I promise them anonymity. So there were people that were speaking to me about that too. And a former mentor of mine once said, source relationships are never a one-way relationship. You're not just extracting information from the source. It needs to be two-way. They need to feel like they're getting something out of you as well. And sometimes that's information where a lot of them are siloed within the organization, and they themselves had no idea what was going on in other parts of the organization. So they would speak to me saying, hey, am I the only one that feels this way? Or is the thing that I'm seeing only happening here? Or what have you heard in other parts of the company? And I could then give them a bigger picture of what was happening. And I think the last reason was, pretty much everyone I spoke to felt that they were seeing something historic, whether they thought it was something bad or whether they thought it was something profoundly good. So I also spoke with many people who loved working at OpenAI and thought that OpenAI was deeply, positively transformative for the world. And they just wanted it documented. They wanted someone to tell the story of the choices that were made, the discussions that were had, and how people felt along the way as well, and all of those scenic moments. So I think that, broadly speaking, were the 3 major categories.
Okay, we're going to open it up in a second for people to ask questions, so feel free to come to the microphone. Make sure your questions are actually questions, not statements, and short and with a question mark at the end. And in the meantime, let me just ask you this. What is the consequence? Because the name OpenAI comes from this ethic, right? Which is to be open and transparent, which is exactly what as soon as you wrote something critical, that was taken away from you, that transparency in your process. But even more so, this idea that there's a do-gooder ethic and then it changes and it's not as transparent, and maybe it wasn't really in earnest to begin with. Yeah. That we saw that with Google, the don't be evil and all of that. What do you think is the consequence of doing that, right? So I could see an apologist for that saying, like, it changed. We decided to become a for-profit company. We needed more secrecy because there were too many things going on that were too complex and people were taking them out of context. What's the argument for why, like, when you found a company on certain principles, you found it as a nonprofit, for keeping it that way?
I mean, in general, I don't know if the solution. I don't want to prescribe a specific solution, like they should have just stayed a nonprofit and then all the world would be well. I'm not sure it's as easy as that, but the thing that we have lost in the layers and layers of opacity that they've continued to add onto not just the company's operations, but fundamentally the technology, as I mentioned, they monopolize our scientific understanding of even the limitations of this technology. The thing that we've lost is now the ability to for the broader public to have to democratically contest this technology and how they want it to go. And so the biggest consequence, the thing that I originally, when I started the book, I was focused on trying to highlight vertical harms, because I wanted to show that, first of all, digital technologies have a physical supply chain that involve workers, that involve physical data centers in the world, and that there's labor exploitation, there's environmental harms. And I was thinking about it that way. And by the time I finished reporting the book, I realized that there's a horizontal harm that's happening here, that every single community that I spoke to that had been impacted by this supply chain, and also communities that are being impacted by the deployment of this technology, like teachers, students, they all were saying the same thing, this feeling of a loss of agency over the ability to self-determine their future. And the horizontal harm is that in a world where the majority of people feel that way, democracy doesn't exist anymore, because democracy is predicated on the beautiful philosophy that we all have a right to have a say in our future. And that's why we get to vote. And we get to collectively determine that. But all of these people were saying they didn't even feel like they had agency and control over their own lives anymore, let alone the collective future of a greater community, a greater group of people. And so that, to me, is the threat of these layers of opacity, is that the empire continues to fortify itself. It continues to make itself stronger. It continues to accrue wealth and power, and everyone else loses out, and we return to the age of empire and lose democracy.
Sobering. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Those have been fascinating remarks. As someone who's also in journalism and sort of thinking about the future of our profession, I am very curious about this question of, when we're seeing ChatGPT results, are we seeing something that's approaching or at some point could become actual cognition, or something that's just very good at spitting out language that seems like it's got thought behind it, but doesn't actually, and has all these hallucinations. So I'm wondering, from the reporting you've done, the people you've spoken to, how close do you think we are, if we're even on the path towards it, of solving these hallucinations and moving towards cognition in AI?
There's so many different ways to answer that question, and it's but I'll try to make it short. But one of the most famous AI systems that came before is a system called ELIZA in the 1960s, developed by an MIT professor named Joseph Weizenbaum. And it was the first chatbot to pass the Turing test. And it was also a chatbot. It was also the same exact interface that used language. And Weizenbaum actually developed it specifically to prove how humans are particularly vulnerable to falling for things that talk to us, appear to talk to us, and ascribing cognition, consciousness to those things. And he originally did it as an experiment where he was going to put this thing out and then reveal the conceit in 2 years. And then when he revealed it, no one cared. They all thought that the chatbot still had consciousness. And he actually became so alarmed by that he ended up spending the rest of his career writing against the development of technologies that appear to replicate human intelligence. So I guess the way that I want to answer your question is, there is something about these systems that tap into human psychology in a way that, no, it's probably not reaching cognition, but people are very, very deeply vulnerable to that idea. And there was this really great New York Times article just recently by Cade Metz, who's a longtime AI reporter, where the headline was "Why We Are Not Getting to Artificial General Intelligence Anytime Soon." And it cites in there a survey done of AI researchers, longtime AI researchers, and 75% of them think that we are not anywhere close, and we don't even have the techniques to get there. But that's not usually what you hear, because companies have come to dominate our perception of these tools. But the last thing I'll say is, you also realize this if you start speaking to ChatGPT in any other language other than English. It immediately starts to break down. So yeah, so I think that's kind of 3 answers to your question.
Yeah, and just very extremely quick follow-up. Is there anything we can do to prevent the public having this sort of psychological want to make this feel human?
I think one thing we can do is, as journalists, is stop anthropomorphizing the technology. I think it's really, really common for media articles these days to say, an AI learns like a child. And I think that continues to perpetuate that idea that there's something there behind these large language models.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was fascinating. And I'm going to try to read the book, although I doubt very much I'll understand it. I am a visitor from a foreign country, the 20th century. I don't have GPS in my car. See, no phone. I don't know. I don't do social media. I don't know how. I'm a physician. And you go back now a ways. And I remember when we got electronic health records. And the whole idea then, it was called big data. And the idea was going to be that we were going to extract all kinds of information about diseases and tests and stuff from big data. And it made sense because these healthcare systems now have thousands of lives from which they can extract enough big data. I mean, their pools are enormous. But did it ever happen?
It's still happening.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I'm going to make sure we move through
Okay.
the line. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's still happening. I actually have a friend who's working on a startup on this exact thing. And it turns out it's really hard, which is why it's been happening for years and years and years, and shows not only the fact that, yeah, the maturity of these technologies is actually extremely uneven, but it's also like, to even be able to just extract some data and patterns and then voila, solve a problem is in and of itself something we should be skeptical of. And that's why we have not magically cured all diseases after big data arrived a few years ago.
Okay, you'll notice there's a long line behind you, so succinct questions are
I'm
welcome.
going to have a very succinct question. I'd like to move from talking about Elon Musk and Sam Altman to the people you said in the global south who are actually scrubbing. I don't think most of us are aware of how many people are involved in that work. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I couldn't even tell you a figure because these companies hide those numbers, but it's most likely in the millions that these workers do work, and they do different categories of work. Some of them do what's called reinforcement learning from human feedback. Very, very long technical term, but effectively they're chatting with the chatbots and then upvoting and downvoting their responses to try and get the chatbot to then speak in ways that are more engaging. And also companies try to then use this method to get them to speak in more honest ways. It hasn't really worked. But another category of work is the content moderation, where because these tools can say anything, it would be a huge PR crisis for these companies if they just start spewing hateful, toxic speech at millions of users. And so they develop these content moderation filters that wrap around the model and try to block those responses from coming out. And those filters in and of themselves are machine learning technologies, so they need to be trained on data sets, and workers will read through reams of the worst the worst text on the internet, and also AI generated text, where OpenAI will prompt AI models to imagine the worst text on the internet. And they then have to annotate it into these detailed taxonomies. Is this sexual content? Is this sexual abuse content? Is it involving children? Is this violent content? Is this extremely graphic violent content? And it's the same as what we've seen with social media, where these workers end up completely traumatized, and not just them, but their families fall apart, their communities fall apart, because the people who depend on them lose a core foundational individual.
Congratulations on a great book. I listened to the audiobook 15 hours straight on a drive from DC to Florida, which is a wonderful book. I feel like, most of where I get my information from is like Hard Fork. It's like Ezra Klein. And I do feel like after listening to your book and just reading more, that so much of the press is captured. And like most people sort of preface their statement about AGI as like, I just talked to a bunch of researchers and they tell me X, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, like from your perspective, are there what are the resources that we should be looking at to get a more well-rounded understanding of AGI or of artificial intelligence in general? Because I just feel like we're just being talked to by Sam Altman and Eric Schmidt and all these folks. And then secondly, if you have any comments on the reconciliation bill, the language in the reconciliation bill, I'd be curious what you think about that.
Yeah. So in terms of sources, for me personally, I usually look up whether or not an expert is financially conflicted by these organizations before taking into account their opinion, And so there's some organizations that I really love, AI Now Institute, Data and Society Institute, both in New York, that do a lot of critical research on these tools and their societal and policy implications. Brian Merchant is a journalist that I adore, who's writing this newsletter called Blood in the Machine that is really, really good, that also has a more critical perspective on the conquest of AGI. And when I talk with researchers, I'm always looking at like, what are their affiliations, who's funding their labs, and unfortunately, as I mentioned before, like these companies have such a monopoly on the talent that there is actually a very, very diminishing pool of AI researchers that aren't financially conflicted. And so one of the policy solutions that I would propose that unfortunately I don't think is going to happen in the US in this environment, but I did spend yesterday night having dinner with some EU policymakers and like hammering this home to them, is we really need more funding, public funding for independent AI expertise, so that we can start having more of that not financially conflicted people to consult with. And on the reconciliation bill, I think it is one of the worst possible things that could happen if the moratorium on AI regulation actually goes into effect. For people that don't know, the reconciliation bill has a clause that would ban AI regulation at the state level for the next 10 years. And I just think that it's going to enshrine Silicon Valley's impunity into law. And so, I mean, we'll have to see what happens. But if that happens, just to end on a more optimistic note, if that happens, there's still a lot of work that can be done. We do not have to wait for policymakers and regulators to do the things for us. There are a lot of stories that I highlight in the book of an enormous amount of community, civil society activism, where people are, artists are suing these companies for intellectual property infringement. Water activists are pushing back on data centers using their freshwater resources. There are workers that are unionizing to add a clause into their worker contracts about when AI can be deployed and what work the AI models can be trained on. All of this we need to do 100,000 times fold and continue to push against and contain the empire.
Thank you. Fascinating and sobering. As someone who worked to site data centers along the Columbia River in a former life, I'm glad that you pointed out the issue of the massive amount of resource that is required for the internet, for big data, for AI. It's astounding. And I've often wondered whether or not the current administration's fixation on the 51st state is a power grab for Canada's resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And Greenland, yeah, Greenland is a place where they're also eyeing for data center development. And yeah, like as I already mentioned the energy piece, but the fresh water piece is also, these data centers have to be cooled. And either you cool them with energy, effectively AC, or you cool them with a mix of energy and fresh water. It has to be fresh water because otherwise the water starts to corrode the equipment. And so most of the time, it actually enters these communities and plugs into the public drinking water supply because that is the thing, that is the infrastructure that's been laid for delivering fresh water. And Bloomberg recently had an incredible story that looked at the distribution of these data centers around the world. And it turns out that 2/3 of the ones being developed for AI right now are entering water scarce areas, 2/3 of them. And so it's not just the volume of fresh water, but the distribution of these data centers that is causing huge amounts of problems. And an OpenAI employee told me they're running out of land and power. So absolutely, the reason why the U.S. is trying to expand in all of these places is to get more land and to get more of those natural resources.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe we should take the last couple questions all together. Just ask your questions so that she can get them all in because there's only a few minutes left.
Okay. Thank you so much. Also, congratulations. I also immediately downloaded the audiobook, so I'm about halfway through it. Splitting that between surveillance capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, which the implications of this are pretty terrifying. Combining them, sorry, I'll be brief. You mentioned that without rights to privacy, we can't have democracy. And much of what you're discussing about the dynamics of these companies, the siloing, gaslighting from management, similar to union busting efforts to keep people from organizing. Are there organizing efforts of these companies? Maybe you can't discuss that. What are effective ways of building power with one another that we can hold power to count?
Okay. And do you mind if we just collect the last?
Hi, thank you so much, Karen. Simultaneously to like all of this AI hype, adapt or die, AI first, kind of hurtling towards that inevitability, that presumed inevitability, we're also seeing this huge global reckoning around social media and all the retroactive harms we've seen, and literally the way that like we relate to one another and to the world. Like they're banning it from schools, from countries. There's like 30 books in this bookstore about attention. Do you see any reflection, especially in the AI optimists that you talk to, whether they're regulators or in the industry, any self-reflection about that, or is it just straight up cognitive dissonance?
Hi, thank you. I'm a middle school history teacher. We talk about empires and the British East India Company in my class. My students are also particularly vulnerable to the temptation to use ChatGPT for homework. I wonder what are maybe like the key points you would want young people to take for your book, knowing that they're staring at a longer future ahead than we are.
Oh my God, these
So,
are three
yes.
really meaty questions. Okay, wait, I need to remember.
So, unionization of
Yes.
workers against AI.
Self-reflection and advice for
education.
kids.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there are starting to be worker movements. I mean, there have long been tech worker movements within the tech industry. I think they're starting to creep into AI. There are many former employees that are starting to write open letters and starting to speak out about what these companies are doing. And my sense is that there is a little bit of that happening within the companies now as well. So, but again, like, it's not something that we should rely on. And this kind of ties to the second question of, is there any self-reflection? One of the things about empires is they really benefit people at the top. And that's why there is often a lack of self-reflection, is because the people at the top are not actually experiencing all of these harms. And they actually only get exposed to the profound, amazing things about the technology and are richly rewarded by that. And so even though I think worker organizing within the tech industry is one ingredient that can help facilitate things, it's not going to be the primary one. And there needs to continue to be, as I mentioned, like I think about the whole supply chain of AI development and how all of the different stages of this AI supply chain, the data that they need, the land that they need, the fact that they need schools to agree to even have technologies deployed in these contexts, that these are actually sites of democratic contestation. And in your life, think about all of the different sites that you have access to, whether there's a data center being built near your community, whether your kids are in a school that's talking about an AI policy, whether your office is developing an AI policy, and be part of that. Not like we don't just need unionization, we don't just need tech workers to rise up, we need everyone to be asserting themselves, giving themselves a seat at the table in each of these environments. And I would say to the kids that the number one thing that I hope they can take away is that they have a choice in shaping a technology that is going to be their future. They like how this technology goes is ultimately how their lives are going to go. And so when they use these tools, they're ultimately ceding power to these companies, and they should ask themselves whether or not it's those companies that they want to do that for.
Karen, this is such an extraordinary book. Congratulations. I'm going to abuse the moderator's privilege to ask you one last question. You talked to a scholar who include this illuminating insight in your book, which is that we should stop evaluating technologies like AI based on whether they're good or bad, because answering the question of whether technology is good or bad is always very confusing and a jumble, and instead ask whether they consolidate power or distribute it. Do you have a favorite example from the work you've done, whether it's in the book or out there in the world right now, of a way of developing technology that distributes that power, that advances democracy instead of holds it back?
That insight is from a really dear friend of mine, Ria Kaluri. She's an AI researcher, just finished her PhD at Stanford. But the example that I really love through the work, the reporting that I've done, is there's this organization in New Zealand called Tahiku Media. It's a Maori radio station. They broadcast in the Maori indigenous language. And one of the things they really wanted to do was they had all this rich archival audio of the Maori language, and Maori is a language that has disappeared over time because of the legacies of colonization, and they wanted to tap into their rich repository and turn it into an educational resource for Maori people all around the world to reclaim that language, to listen to the sounds of their ancestors. But they realized that they needed to be able to transcribe that audio so that it could be a helpful resource. People could listen to it, see it, click on the words, be able to translate it so that they can actually learn from this repository. And because there's so few Maori speakers in the world, they decided to turn to AI. They thought, we need to build a Maori speech recognition tool for doing this kind of transcription work. They took a fundamentally different approach to AI development than Silicon Valley. First and foremost, they asked the community, do you want AI? The community said, yes, we do. And then they went on to the next step. Then they said, we will only train this data on data that is donated willingly with informed consent. So they created a community drive, essentially, where they educated people on what AI is, how it works, why they need the data. And they also specifically said, when you give us the data, these are the terms under which we will guard and protect your data. We will never use it for any other project unless it is with the explicit continued consent of the community. They then were able to get a ton of support. Community donated a lot of data, a couple hundred hours, which it pales in comparison to the amount of data that these companies have, but it was high enough quality data that they actually got a very performant speech recognition model, and they were able to start doing their work. And they created then a license that is legally binding, and if anyone ever wants access to that data, they get permission from the community, and then that person needs to sign off on terms of service, essentially, or terms of agreement, where they cannot use the data in certain ways that might end up harming the community. And so the entire process was about enabling, empowering, and reversing colonization rather than perpetuating it. And I think this is a vision that we need to see many, many, many more places around the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much for painting a picture of a different model than the one we have and for writing this book.
Thank you so much for coming.